Okay, I think we're ready to get started here. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for attending this event sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists New England chapter. My name is Jody Rave Spotted Bear, and I'm here tonight with Brooke Kroeger, an esteemed reporter and author of Undaunted: How Women Changed American Journalism. And thank you to everyone who is in the audience and joined us on Zoom. We will be recording this so viewers can watch and review this conversation later at their convenience. Now, we are here to offer a warm welcome to Brooke, a professor emerita at NYU. She's the author of 6 books, a former UN correspondent for Newsday and deputy metropolitan editor for New York Newsday. She spent more than 11 years with United Press International in its Script Howard days. She reported from Chicago, Brussels, London, and Tel Aviv, where she was bureau chief before returning to London to become the agency's division editor for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So, Brooke, thank you for joining us. And let's open your book and talk about Undaunted: How Women Changed American Journalism. And again, thank you for everyone else who's tuning in today or will tune in to view this, what is promising to be an amazing recording. Now, Brooke, I understand that you're going to start off our conversation with a video.
I am. Here it comes. Although men have dominated American journalism since mass media dawned, the women who work in its most competitive bastions have been a potent force in shaping its history and its present. Undaunted tells their story, decade by decade, in a representative way. It examines how women journalists, against all odds, found ways to thrive at the top of this vital field, in places and positions where they have yet to find easy welcome. Undaunted examines the experiences of the best remembered and the long forgotten. It begins with Margaret Fuller's improbable rise in the 1840s and the high-earning star reporters of the mid-19th century. It traces the breakthrough investigative triumphs of Nellie Bly, Ida Tarbell, and Ida B. Wells. It showcases the standout careers of women who covered major news stories in every conflict at home and abroad since before the Civil War. It looks closely at those who succeeded and stumbled in top newsroom jobs. Undaunted also chronicles the collective fight for equity, from the gentle stirrings of the late 1800s through the legal suits of the 1970s to the Me Too uprising and today's racial and gender disparities. As a byproduct, it contains plenty of still sound career advice along with some cautionary tales. Undaunted is about American women who ignored every impediment put in their way to do journalism's most valued work, with emphasis on the huge and singular impact exceptional women have had on journalism and journalism's impact on them. Undaunted: How Women Changed American Journalism by Brooke Kroeger from A.A. Knopf, 2023.
Wow, that was a very impressive montage of some really remarkable women in journalism. And your book, I saw a New York Times review that said your information there in the book was encyclopedic in the very best sense. And from what I have read of the book, it's like, wow, you really did your research and an incredible amount of research and brought to light the lives of some women journalists that if we as journalists think we have a hard time, you portray such a wonderful picture of going back into the 1800s of women breaking into journalism. So with such an array of voices and stories, it's like, where do we start on this? But you do explore the lives and careers of journalists between 1840 and today, including Margaret Fuller, Nellie Bly, Ida Tarbell, Ida B. Wells, Joan Didion, Cokie Roberts. We talked earlier, Suzette LaFlèche. And how did you find the time, not necessarily at the time, but how did you just sort through all of these women to feature in the book?
Well, I used an unscientific method to create consistency. So I used a lot of proprietary databases, the kinds of things you can't just get on Google, but being a university professor gives you a lot of really fantastic access. And in each case, I took them decade by decade because the book is strictly chronological. So you can really see the journey of women as a group through a field where no one really wanted them until they had to have them.
Mhm.
And I use two terms, women and journalism, trying to get, sort of aggregate responses in each decade. And from that search term method, I was able to identify the women people were talking about, the women who bubbled to the surface in their own time, or even 40 years later, like in the case of someone like Margaret Fuller, at the end of the 19th century, a couple of books that would say the 24 most important women writers of the century, things like that, that their names would still appear 60 years later. And she really mostly wrote as a journalist. She, her books are compendiums of her previous work, or it's her great lawsuit, which gets turned into the big women's treatise. So we really can call her a journalist, I think, even though we think of her philosophically in other ways. Her oeuvre is journalism for the most part. And if you're still talking about a journalist 60 years later, after they're dead and their work lasts only really a few years, I think that's worth noting. People who showed up in those kinds of lists, even into the 60s and 70s and 80s, would make me take notice. People whose work was important during important global events, and huge trends, when the work would show up like that, would be important. People who became figures of popular culture, like Nellie Bly, or even Ida Tarbell to some extent, or Ida B. Wells, you had to pay attention to. So that's the way people got into the book. Or the other way they got in was if their stories were singular in a way that really explained things that I knew to be true, true of the experience that Jody, you would have, or I would have, or any of us who do this work.
Okay. Now, your book starts off with the 1840s. How did a woman break into journalism in 1840? It seems almost impossible, especially even in today's light, when we know that the tough road that many women in journalism still face. So how did they do that more than 100 years ago?
Two ways, 180 years ago.
180.
Almost 200 years ago. Two ways. Either they were phenomenal networkers like Margaret Fuller, who we first have to say was a genius. I mean, she was someone very, very particular. And men noticed what was special about her. They noticed her gifts, even though she was homely, off-putting in her style, kind of repellent in a way, and yet people were able to overcome that because there was so much about her that was really special. She made very important friendships with Ralph Waldo Emerson, with Horace Greeley, and really through their wives, was able to cultivate them also as friends. And in the case of Greeley, his wife was very enamored of her from her Boston Conversations, which she was holding to help women learn how to systematize their knowledge, which, you weren't learning in charm school, which is basically what most women was available to most women as an educational opportunity. So she really worked to do that. She was brilliant and very well tutored by her father. and very friendly with Lydia Maria Child, who was 8 years older, but they studied John Locke together. I mean, you know, they were really serious women. And Mary Greeley just wanted her in her circle. So she convinced Horace to make her the next literary editor of the New York Tribune, the biggest paper in the country. And not only that, but invited her to live with them. Everything okay?
Oh, I'm sorry, my husband just interrupted me. He has been gone all day and he doesn't know I'm in the middle of a Zoom call. So my
Oh, never
apologies.
mind. Okay, no problem. So, so anyway, she gets, you know, after the Dial, where Emerson puts her to work for 2 years at this great magazine, not enormously circulated, but important in cultural circles, moves to become the literary editor of the Tribune, which means she's running her column on the front page next to Greeley's, if you can imagine. She, after not very long, just a few months of doing, you know, Goethe and reveries about Thanksgiving and stuff like that, she and literary critiques, she suddenly decides she wants to report New York City's underbelly. So she starts investigating the charitable institutions and writing about the work they're doing, what's right about it, what's wrong about it. She does that for a while. I mean, she kind of does everything any woman or man journalist would ever like to do. And then after 2 years, pops off to Europe on a new arrangement with the Tribune, starts by writing sort of travel pieces, and then runs into the Italian Revolution, which she then covers. And that's kind of her story. So, so that's one way. The other way was through the abolition press. So women who had bigger ambitions than writing poetry and sweet little stories, which women could kind of always do. I mean, there was always room for that. But women who had higher ambitions, who wanted to do, you know, quote unquote, men's work, found their way in through the abolition press. So why would the abolition press hire them? Because they didn't have any money. And the women weren't asking for a lot of money. They were looking for opportunity to get published, doing more serious work. Who was reading the abolition press? Every editor in the country was reading it. So their work would get seen. And from there, this is just after Margaret Fuller, women like Grace Greenwood and Gail Hamilton, who both took this route, were writing for the Atlantic for the next, you know, 30 or 40 years, or for the New York Times for the next 30 or 40 years, and became huge household names in the 1850s and 1860s, very forgotten today, but very well known in their time. So those were the two ways in.
So you mentioned Greenwood, Hamilton, and Clemmer, and it's a trio who you described as whose originality, distinctive voice, and insight set them apart and made their bylines household names. So can you talk more about them and the times in which they lived and worked? How does a woman in the 1850s become a household name again when that bar is set pretty high to even get your foot in the door of a publication or a newspaper?
So Adam asked me to highlight the New Englanders. So Mary Clemmer, her first job is at the Springfield paper. Mm-hmm. And she becomes an important Washington correspondent through her Brooklyn connections once she moves to New York. She's really interesting. She's married off at a very young age to a minister, and clearly this is not a marvelous marriage. They are living in the Maryland Heights of Virginia, and she, from her kitchen window, reports the Battle of Harper's Ferry, sends it off to various papers. It's published all over the country over and over again, and that kind of establishes her. She becomes a Washington correspondent, and at a certain point, her old friend at the Springfield paper, where she had written a poem that got published when she was a schoolgirl, asks her to write about, you know, what it is to be a woman Washington correspondent. And she just slams what the women are being asked to do. And she's, no wonder they're covering parties and talking about fancy dress and such as that. She was one of the highest paid reporters, man or woman, of her era, writing for the Independent, which was pretty impressive. And Greenwood was writing for the New York Times and other publications. She had a lilty kind of style that was very much appreciated. And Gail Hamilton had this marvelous singular style, wrote for the Atlantic for years and years. Both of them had a similar experience to Margaret Fuller in the sense that they were in Gamaliel Bailey's home in Washington. And like the Greeley home, these were centers of social Washington, like his was social New York. So you met everybody who was anybody. I'm saying these women were extraordinary networkers. I mean, I was very struck by this throughout the women in the book, how many of them had this skill and still do.
There is, I believe it was Clemmer who you said wrote about the battle at Harper's Ferry from the kitchen.
Her kitchen window, yeah.
From her kitchen window. And that really made me think, okay, was she already a very, like practiced journalist at that time? I mean, how do you think that unfolded where
I think she's eating a piece of apple pie and she looks out her window and this is happening, in her yard, basically. And she takes notes. And, when the battle got really close, she admits she ran to the cellar, but for most of it, she took it. And her descriptions of the bombing, of everything of the cannonade is really quite remarkable. So she established herself very quickly. And, these were women with education. They were not, just housewives. So there was also, this is an era where the aspiration had begun. Remember, Seneca Falls had happened in what, 1840, mid 1840s, 1846, I think. So it was already in the zeitgeist that opportunity for women should come, or was coming, or was there if you could figure out how to take it.
Okay. And then moving on into your own personal work as a journalist and an author. You've written 6 books, including Nellie Bly, Daredevil, Reporter, Feminist. And what was it like to write about Bly again? And was there anything you included in this book that you were able to include in your biography of her?
Oh, so I've written about Bly now. I've managed to get her into most of my books. And I always have a little bit different take on her, just always a little bit different. And certain realizations come, like by the time I wrote Undercover Reporting, which was in, I think, 2012, that's already a long time ago, goodness. I had come to understand that everything we remember about her, even though her life was legend from the time she was 22 till she dies at 58, I think. Everything we know about her, or that we care about, or that anybody wants to make a movie about that never gets made, I can tell you about a lot of those, is only about 2.5 years of her life. So imagine being able to establish a legend like that from 2.5 years of work, from the insane asylum to the trip around the world. And nobody really cares about anything else, even though she was the first woman covering the Eastern Front in World War I as a woman in her 50s. I mean, kind of remarkable in itself. And wrote important, interviews with Susan B. Anthony and Emma Goldman when she was in the Tombs. I mean, she did some really spectacular stuff afterwards, and yet nobody cares about anything except those 2.5 years. But what struck me about that was it was only 2.5 years. I mean, who has a 2.5-year career that becomes a legend? It's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, that is extraordinary. Just considering people today know who Nellie Bly is, and there's still movies being made, that romanticize
in this book, I grouped her with the 2 Idas, Ida Tarbell and Ida B. Wells, not because they knew each other, because they didn't. as near as I could tell. I think that Ida Tarbell takes a swipe at Nellie in one of her articles. I mean, that's just me saying that, but I believe it's the case. Because Ida Tarbell is making the case that to be a woman journalist, you have to study political economy, you have to spend your dowry to get educated to do this. Nellie Bly had not even a 9th grade education. She went to a normal school for 1 semester. That's all at like 14, 15 years old. And then moves to Pittsburgh and is really self-trained and self-taught. So I think that was a swipe at her where she's saying, you know, if you want to do real journalism, you want to do real work, not, you know, I am there, you can believe me, which was Nellie's style of investigation. You can't really compare it to the two Idas, Ida Tarbell and Ida B. Wells, who did hardcore investigative documentary work at that very early point. And yet age-wise, they really fall in the same group. I mean, I wonder if I can turn around and show you this. Maybe this might be a big mistake, but I have a timeline, but behind me is this timeline that goes from Margaret Fuller's birth all the way to the present, with the birth lines of every woman who was considered for this book held over against the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, the Great Depression, the Spanish Civil War, the World War II. So those periods are there, and then you can see where the women's lives fall, which was very helpful to me in figuring out how to do this book.
I'd actually love to see that if you want to just.
I'm gonna turn it around,
Yeah,
but you know, it's a big desktop. So let me try.
Yeah.
I have stuff over it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you see how it works? So is that visible?
Yeah. I mean, you can't read it, but you can definitely see the timeline.
Yeah. So it was really helpful to me to be able to see who fell in a period where it was important to talk about what was happening historically, and to see if there was a way to have stories that matched. One of the things I hear, you know, sometimes, or I've noticed in nasty comments here and there, is like, oh, so-and-so is not in this book. How did you leave out so-and-so? And the book is representative. It wasn't meant to include everybody. The stories that got in, or where someone, sometimes it's an activist. Activists are not in this book. You know, Gloria Steinem is in there until she gets involved with the movement. But before that, she's really a freelancer, you know, and did some things that people still talk about, like her bunny expose, which I did mention. But so it doesn't include activists. It doesn't include women's magazines. It doesn't include women's departments, because I'm not writing about that. I'm writing about the women who competed directly with men, who were doing jobs that men would envy, you know, which is kind of a crass way of putting it, but at times when that was really, really hard to accomplish. And the one, you know, sort of, there's a couple of exceptions. John Darnton's mother, who was an early women's editor at the New York Times in the 40s, she tried hard to make the case that women's news should not be fluff. So I used that. And then Charlotte Curtis, who turned fluff into something that really became serious social commentary, and really set the mark for how women's pages could be elsewhere. So, you know, those would be the two exceptions. And I think Charlotte Curtis had to be mentioned because she turned the women's pages into a power nexus, and everywhere else they were not that. You know, that would not be a path to top editor. It just, I mean, it happened a couple of times, but not a general path, if you see what I'm saying.
Right. Now, you know, we had been talking about Bly and, you know, her 2.5 years and her insane asylum stint, foray, or whatever you want to call that. But were there other important investigations pioneering women in journalism conducted that might not be as well known today?
Well, what comes to mind when you ask is the Mirage Tavern expose that the Chicago Tribune did in the 70s, which was huge. I'm thinking of the Latino migrant undocumented worker expose in the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, also in the 70s, about 2 years after the Mirage Tavern one. That's really also extraordinary. She poses as an undocumented worker and does this early. Those are two I can think of that nature. And then of course Walter Reed. I mean, there are so many that were really done by women that have won Pulitzers and been really important. I went through the entire Pulitzer listings for every single year and counted up every woman whose name is mentioned as a prize winner. So that wouldn't include when it's just the publication, but if people are singled out or individually win, that's really revelatory, because the prizes are founded in 1917, I believe. The first woman doesn't win till 1937, and that's a pretty interesting story. And then another woman doesn't win for another 14 years. And it's sort of like that until we get to the 80s and 90s. It takes a long time before it becomes commonplace.
Yeah. Again, going back to the 2.5 years of that a lot of people focus on for Bly, but I know in your book there were some people who criticized her going into the New York insane asylum, but how would you describe that particular writing?
Well, it was in its time, it was a breakthrough. I mean, not that she was necessarily the first. I mean, she's the first who gets a big reputation from doing it. What was important about it in its period was it was one of the first places where women who had been welcomed into the field to write about women and society and flower shows and rubber raincoats and things like, and gossip. Gossip starts in 1850. Department store ads. This was good for papers. This was good for revenue because it created a place that men didn't want to write about. So it created a place for women to get in. Always this, still happens. People are looking for entry. So you think, oh, that's going to get me in, but really it becomes often another ghetto. Stunt work, which is what Nellie was doing, or, expose or detective journalism, it had a lot of names, was these cute chicks, with lots of daring do, who are willing to undertake sometimes harrowing, dangerous, or fascinating subjects, and do them as personal narrative. So as a journalistic form, it leads the way into more serious investigative work. It's like a chute down which the Ida Tarbells and Ida B. Wells start to do their work. So I think it's important in that sense. But most of those women fade away very quickly. The ones who have bigger careers, like Annie Laurie in San Francisco, others like that, end up doing columns on the women's pages, or they become sob sisters, which is the next era where women are in the courtrooms, being the Mary Sunshine figure in the Broadway show Chicago, which actually was a play written by a woman journalist who was working the crime beat at the Chicago Tribune. And that's where she got the idea for the play.
Okay, so you talked about some of the women fading away, and in Undaunted, you write that, quote, very few of the women journalists in these pages have legacies that endured or will endure much beyond their own moment. So who are some of these unheralded women?
But let's just stop and say that's true of most men in the field too. I mean, journalism is ephemera. It is meant to disappear. No one should feel bad about not having a legacy. No one should feel bad, because that's the nature of the work. It's meant to be for today, tomorrow, this week, this month. That's the nature of the beast. So you have to make your peace with that. I think where we get impressed is where we see that legacies, some legacies do endure, and some of them belong to women. So you think of someone like Joan Didion or Martha Gellhorn, or, you know, people who are really in the annals in a serious way, people who we still admire today, people whose work, Rachel Carson, people whose work we are celebrating, honoring with seminars and conferences 50 years later. How many journalists of any stripe can you say that about? You know, not people who are being rediscovered, but people who have endured because of the work they've done. So, wow, you know, and I did pay attention to those women as well.
Yeah, that really gives you something to take pause of and think about. Very good points you're making. Now, were there any women journalists who you weren't able to include in the book that you wish you could have? You mentioned how you had your
system. Yeah, sure, many. So, for example, there are 120 pages of endnotes. The book is really not very long. It's 398 pages, which is really reasonable. It just looks fat because of these endnotes, which is all the material. It was like 30,000 words that I excised for length and just couldn't give up. So that's there. And then there are great figures, really interesting figures. But let's say a story had been told earlier, you know, that was very much of the contours of their story. So, you know, Pauline Frederick becomes a more interesting figure for me in broadcast than, say, Barbara Walters, because she's 15 years earlier, doing serious work at the UN and in political conventions and things like that, which was, you know, very, very novel in her day. And another thing that really interests me is how many women hit their stride after 40, which you kind of wouldn't expect in a field that so values its young, but it's quite common. I mean, it's surprisingly common. And I sort of love that about a number of these figures that I did include. I included quite a few that you've never heard of and will never hear of again, that just have remarkable stories. Some of them because of what it took to get there, and some of them because of the work they produced. Do you want to talk a little bit about Suzette LaFlèche before we get way into the future?
Yeah, I would like to do that, because she, you know, there's a few fleeting paragraphs in your book about her, but for people who don't know about her, it is a very remarkable story. So how would you introduce Suzette LaFlèche?
I'm going to share screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Suzette LaFlèche. She lived from 1854 to 1903. She was also known, her other name was, I'm going to say it badly probably, Inshata Theumba, but in print, she signed herself as Bright Eyes. She worked for the Omaha World Herald, and she was married to one of the top editors at the paper. And, you know, this is another way women made their way in, through connections. I mean, how do you get noticed? It was networking again. She was from a very prominent, affluent family. So this is a story from Wounded Knee, January 2nd, 1891. I don't know if you can see my cursor. The horrors of war. And I'm sure he was working with her. They went together. So, but her stories were republished all over the country. So that's the reason she's included, not because she's Native American, but because she was of this era, writing about war, and probably one of the very earliest. So she really has real significance in terms of the story I was telling. So here we go at Pine Ridge. The next morning, after the wounded had been brought in by the 7th Cavalry, my companion and I, that was really her husband, went to see some of the wounded Indian women and children, most of whom had been carried into the Episcopal Church. The wounded Indians were given into the charge of Major Butler, who had been in the services of the frontier for about 30 years. A few days ago, before the affair happened, Major Butler said to me, "Every time we have had an affair like this, I have thought and hoped that this will be the last one." I said, This surely will be the last one. He said, that is just what I thought each time up till now, etc. And you can see the headlines. Wounded Indian mothers and babies lying on beds in prairie hay, horrible agonies endured by the injured who bear their suffering bravely. Bright Eyes tells of the terrible havoc wrought by the shot of the soldiers, etc. She's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, yeah, this is weighs even more heavily with me because the massacre at Wounded Knee was on December 29th, 1890, and every year tribes from the Cheyenne, the Standing Rock Reservation to the Cheyenne River Reservation down into the Pine Ridge Reservation, there's probably about 300 riders along the way. They're on horseback. It's the dead of winter, and they commemorate this very remarkable history of American Indians. And yeah, to know that there was an Omaha tribe woman reporter there, I mean, that to me, it gives it a whole new perspective. Me being there as a journalist 130 years, after the fact, and just 130 years really isn't that long ago in the point of history. And just as a reporter, seeing these headlines, this is remarkable in itself because a lot of the other headlines weren't maybe as compassionate. We're talking about soldiers who are awarded the medals of honor, highest distinction of military valor, and this is it. There were women and babies lying on hay. It was a very horrendous story, and I'm going to go back and do my own research on what she. I want to read everything she wrote about this because I'm working on my own project about what happened 130 years ago at Wounded.
I can share with you what I have. I'll share my Dropbox folder with you if you
Oh,
like.
that would be awesome.
Just send me your email. I'm happy to do that.
Oh.
She wasn't the only woman there. There were a couple of others, but nobody who did the work she did that got this kind of broad attention because she was, she had authenticity in a situation like this. So that was pretty remarkable. And I must have been, what year was Wounded Knee in the 70s? 74, 73? Has to be 72.
Yeah, right around that time.
Yeah, I was in Chicago. We were fielding the copy, because it was our correspondent was there. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, we fielded it. Chicago was the hub, so we would field it to New York to go out. So yeah,
The story definitely continues. Well, before we move into the more present moment of journalists, I'm going to ask Adam to put his camera on and join in the questioning and the conversation right now. But let's
by the way, these are all the pictures, the 100 pictures that are in this book, also known as $17,000 of rights.
say that again, Brooks.
These pictures that are on my screen now,
Yeah.
these are the pictures that are in the book of various women.
Oh, okay.
I was just simply saying that it cost a fortune to have them in the book. So
really?
I was noticing that. I was noting that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're up into the 1890s, probably about halfway through your book, and moving on into the let's see, I've asked you about women who you might have wanted to include, and then we can go two ways here, Brooke. We can move on into some of the more present day journalists, or we can talk about you and
I'm not so interesting.
your work in the.
We could talk a little bit about the questions that guided the creation of the book, maybe. I mean, that might be interesting to people, like, how do you put together a book like this besides doing the decades and establishing the continuum? I had done work in lots of pieces of this because of Nellie, because of undercover reporting. I mean, I knew the outlines of a lot of this and even had gone deeply into bits, but I had never tried to establish that continuum like the timeline I showed you. And the theme that comes through most strongly, and this I think is true of the civil rights movement, it's true of just feminism in general. It is a story of progress, setback, progress, setback, progress, setback. And I think that's just the nature of change. It's slow and the pendulum swings. So what I would ask is, what stories best illustrated what women were up against in their professional lives? Who surfaced in news coverage? As I mentioned before, I looked at careers that I could chart over 50 years or more, like Martha Gellhorn's, just seeing these women appear over and over again, decade after decade. That would be some forgotten figures like Edith Evans Asbury, who's really fun to read about. I devoted space to the couples phenomenon, like we just saw with Suzette and her husband. The impact of great friendships, which you see later with people like Jill Abramson and Maureen Dowd, and Jane Mayer, who are, pretty seminal in our era. The book has a lot of implied career counseling and cautionary tales. I gave space to how and why the most successful women made their way when this wasn't easy to do, and what happened when they failed. There's some real colossal failure stories in there that are, I think, important to tell. I've talked about, the strategizing and the networking and the abolition journals and the forms that the movement for equity took from the earliest days right up to the present. So we see that as women join forces to try to create change in the aggregate. The evolution of women's work off the women's pages, from the stunt girls to the sob sisters to the front page girls, into the mainstream, which took another 50 years. The particular struggles of women in broadcast. And then I was really, this gets my goat. It's, who are the real trailblazers and pioneers? I get so irritated when obituaries say, trailblazer, breaking ground, for somebody who didn't even come along till the 60s. And I'm just going, 50 years earlier. So it bothers me. But then I had to check myself. And I came to the realization that the reason people feel like trailblazers, even when they're really not, they're like 100 years late to be the trailblazer, is that the path was so hard still that the feeling was as if they were blazing trails, even though they were clearing brush and over, trails that had been blazed long ago. And I think that's very much the nature of the beast, that there are things I can say to you, anecdotes I can tell, and you're going to be nodding your head yes, that happened, in 1860.
No,
So
you'd just used a phrase there earlier about that there were some colossal failures along the way. I'm kind of curious about that because we all learn through failure. So can you talk about that subject a bit?
Jill Abramson was very helpful to me in writing this. Like the second half of the book, from about a little bit of the 1960s, because there were still people to talk to, is based on largely on starting point with interviews. And Jill Abramson's tenure at the New York Times is a particular cautionary tale, and I tell it very fully back to her early days in Boston. Even she was a stringer for Time when she first got out of Harvard. So that's a particularly interesting story. I think most journalists know it. There are earlier ones where a woman becomes an editor of the Miami Herald. No, actually, she did pretty well. She died, unfortunately, after just 3 years, but she was quite successful. But in Louisville, that's a colossal failure story, where a woman who comes up never having been on the city desk, made editor, loses the support of her higher ups, and just colossally fails and really gets pilloried in a terribly unfair way. And she had been on the cover of Time as this amazing thing, a woman. I mean, just stories like that are pretty hard.
Mm-hmm. Are there some particular women today that, even though you might not, I know we have to be careful now of how we use the term trailblazer, but what women do you admire today in journalism?
A lot of them, speaking of Boston, I really admire Jill Lepore. Like, I personally admire her enormously. I read anything she wrote. That would be one. I don't know. This is a terrible thing to do because I admire many. And even my friends, I admire them. Yes.
Okay, well, you had mentioned some of her work, that you read anything she writes. So what is she writing that you find so engaging?
Oh, I mean, often her books and certainly her articles in the New Yorker. She writes on such an array of topics. I mean, she has such breadth and reach. I'm so impressed by that.
All right, now in your book, do you cover the first woman who ever have won a Pulitzer?
Anne McCormick. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's so I have a scoop on that.
Tell us.
I have a scoop. So, I was really interested in like how 20 years later, it takes 20 years there were women who had won for poetry or for plays and things like that, but never a woman journalist. And so I'm going to the record because I'm always interested in the record. So the New York Times story had about 6 or 7 paragraphs on the front page, and it's not in the headline that their correspondent has won the Pulitzer, and she happens not to be a man, which, was news. Like, why wasn't it there? And that it only appears as one line before the jump and kind of flatly. And then inside, they make a point of saying the award was for international reporting. So they do a whole paragraph on the category, which they don't do for anything else. Like, what? It was kind of nutty seeming to me. So I went back to look at the Pulitzer stories from 3 years before and 3 years after. And you could see that there was an established pattern, which was that the play or the book got the big headline, and then the subhead would be whoever won from the Times in every other case except hers. So, what do we make of that? So the records at Columbia, they have all the Pulitzer records in Columbia Rare Books, but they didn't have 1937. And there have been several academic archival works on the Pulitzer archives, which kind of also gloss over 1937 a little bit because it was kind of different. It had only a panel of Columbia professors. No journalists were on that panel for some reason. I don't know why that was and why 1937 particularly. I can't tell you the reason for that, but I was able, through the director of the Pulitzer Prizes at that time, to get her assistant on the case, who really helped me and had a lot of records that are not in the Columbia open records, but were still held privately by the Pulitzer Foundation. And it turned out that you could establish from what they had that the New York Times didn't nominate her. And yeah, it's shocking, right? And what's even more interesting about that is that she had been a stringer for the paper in Europe mostly and in Washington for 14 years. And Adolph Ochs would not give her a job because he would not have a woman in that role. So she is stringing. She identified Mussolini. I mean, she just did some really extraordinary work. Adolph Ochs dies. His son-in-law takes over, Arthur Sulzberger, the first one. And he is a friend of hers. She has networked the Salzburgers. She's close to Iphigene. I mean, again, another great networker, and they're social friends. He immediately instates her as a full correspondent. He gives her a place on the editorial board, the first woman to have this. This is in 1936, and gives her a column. All of that happens, boom, 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 immediately as he becomes publisher. And the next year she wins the prize. So you think, oh, he's nominated her, or, the editor has nominated her, or her editor has nominated her, or something, but none of this is true. And might explain why it was so underplayed, because probably they didn't want to raise these questions. The Columbia professors simply did it by acclamation. There wasn't even a packet. You know how there's always a packet with the Pulitzer and letters to explain, etc. There was nothing. They simply took her articles from, the newspaper, the bound newspaper volumes that the journalism school had, and gave it to her by acclamation. And the way that this came out in the documentation was they do a display of the work after the prizes are won, or for the award ceremony, or, at some point there's an exhibition. And so they asked for the packet to be able to make the display of the letter of nomination, etc., which is what I had gone after. Like, where's the nomination letter? And there wasn't one. And they wrote back and said, there's nothing.
Wow, that is
Shocking, right?
really interesting.
And then when Marguerite Higgins wins 14 years later for Korea, 6 reporters win for Korea, 2 from the AP, 2 from a Chicago paper, the Chicago Times, and 2 from the Herald Tribune, she and Homer Biggert, who's, legendary. And if you look closely at the citations, hers is really for being a girl. It diminishes her when she was so risk-taking and so heroic in the work she did, that the diminishment is appalling.
No, yeah, it really makes you think about where we've been, where we're going now.
Do you want to, we just have a few more minutes. Do you want anyone to, does anyone want to ask a question or put it in chat or something? Or maybe they have. Maybe we should look.
Yeah, we're paying attention, and if we get some questions popping up, then we'll go ahead and ask them. But we do just have a few minutes left, as you noted, and I'm really curious about Katharine Graham and her place in your book.
Yeah, so I did little with her. I did a very little bit. I find her as a magazine columnist, early on in the Washington Post when she's very young. So she gets mentioned as a sideways. I was kind of less interested in legacy ownership situations than women who, achieved in other ways. So I did not do a lot with her.
Mhm.
And Janet Cook it got relegated to the end notes. I did not do a lot about that. I don't think that had to do with her being a woman, in that sense. So it just didn't seem to fit with the rest of the story. And I see here a question about Margaret Fuller as a war correspondent. She certainly had shown that it was possible. So it takes, another 40 years before we see in the 1890s and the Spanish-American War, and then World War I, the Philippines, Greece, we have women in all those wars. And I do quite a lot with that because those women are really forgotten and did some extraordinary work. We have some Globetrotters, Eleanor Franklin Egan, Sadie Neller Miller, who was the first baseball writer back in the 1890s. I mean, some of these who I just never heard of before, I thought were important to pull out. And they were fearless and fabulous. And so, later stories became less interesting to me because I already had an earlier one, was sort of how I felt. What do I hope readers will take away? Oh, Adam is going wild here. Okay. I hope they'll take away this journey of progress setback. I hope they'll take away the contributions that women have made, to new forms of journalism, which you'll see through how stunt work evolves into investigative work. The way women were extremely good and early at the interview, which has become such an important journalistic form. Now look at the number of women war correspondents. Goodness me, women have kind of taken that over, it seems. I wonder what that says. And the book is full of cautionary tales and advice. I mean, you really get some very good ideas about the importance of networking is one thing, which I've said several times, but also behavior, how behavior works against them. We see this a lot in the 20s, where women are sitting on desks and flirting with copy boys and doing things that the men are also doing, but the women really take a hit for. And so that's pretty interesting. The way that women were thought of in the 1840s, that persists because, you know, stereotypes don't die easily, as lesser, as mentally incapable, as limited in their ability to do the most important work. And seeing that not as a matter of education, but as congenital. So if you start from an attitude that women simply don't have ability, imagine how hard that is to overcome, which of course we see with other disadvantaged groups.
Yeah, we're getting some a lot of good questions in the chat, and here's one. What advice do you have for female journalists who are early in their careers?
Oh gosh, read the book. That's my book.
Yeah.
And how's the current backlash affecting women in journalism? I mean, since women are half the population practically, I suppose it's affecting them as much as anyone else. And I mean, look at these the recent episodes we've seen in academia that happen to be relating to women. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that women take a special hit in these matters. And you know, I'm not sure, like my personal advice for women journalists, I don't ever say female, I just say women. You know, you can't say men journalists. Men is not an adjective, but women is. Think about that for a minute. Well, you know, I was going through the editing process. I could say woman journalist, but I couldn't say man journalist. And I was avoiding the use of male and female because I thought that's, you know, those are wrong for this. So there are a lot of workarounds to use, you know, journalists who are men or something like that. I found ways to do it, but that was hard because the language has that limitation, which is interesting. But I think things that would held for my generation, you know, keep your mouth shut, don't stay home with a sick child, don't hold anymore. I think we have a generation that is very different on the question of work-life balance or what they're willing to endure that we endured and just swallowed. The book is full of women swallowing things. There's a great chapter on couples and what happened in the 80s to a couple where the man and the woman are both advancing. Maybe the woman even, you know, on par or ahead of their husbands, and that their careers had to take a dive while the husbands succeeded because of policies of newspapers. That wouldn't happen anymore. So, you know, there has been real change. And then we've also seen that a lot of the advances in the field in terms of maternity, paternity, caregiver leave, I mean, all these things that are really new and, you know, health-wise helpful and life-wise helpful have come where women have been in charge. That seemed that they've led the way on a lot of those changes. So that's another great thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in your book. Do you have any in our final seconds here now? Do you have any parting thoughts about Undaunted?
Oh, well, just that, you know, this book, it follows this one. I'm sorry, I've lost the cover. But this is the 1936 Ladies of the Press by Ishbel Ross, who was one of the original front page girls, a really important fabulous woman journalist, a real model journalist. And it's interesting, you know, it's organized. So it goes up to 1936 from Margaret Fuller, same starting point, but it's organized by beats, by geography, by movements in the field that, you know, women did, and sort of telling great tales about women. And it's really been the only book of this nature that was published for a commercial audience, you know, not in a trade audience, not just for academics. And so, you know, this book is its successor, but I hope, this book also, she only wrote about white women, there's that. But this book goes further, wider, broader, and I hope it'll have the longevity of this one, for which I recently bought a first edition that cost $100. So that's what I'd hope.
Yeah, I'd like to see that, get a copy of that book myself.
You can. I mean, it's available. It's out of print, but it's available. It was published by Harper and Brothers, and it's a fun book. She has a zillion characters you've never heard of and never will, like a lot of men.
Yeah, well, Brooke, this was a fascinating conversation. A really wonderfully well-researched, informative book that it looks like you're going to have a lot more talks about the book, and we really appreciate you joining us here on the call tonight.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, cakes.